I think that the audience has been thoroughly warmed up by the previous speaker. We will now come back to an expert view of the world, because we have here 4 experts whom I will introduce as and when they take the floor. The topic of the hour ahead of us, conflicts in the Middle East, a strategic turning point. So, of course, the context is the first anniversary of the 7th of October, which I will which I don't need to describe. In the last year, everything has changed, and at the same time, nothing has changed. You can ask people in the street, and they'll just say, well, it's just the Israel-Palestine problems. It flares up and then it disappears again. But according to a certain number of military analysts, Israel has almost finished its operations in Gaza. And it has started on southern Lebanon. There also have been major operations on the West Bank, because, well, which we have not really talked about, because there's limits to the ability of journalists to be able to cover everything, and a limit in terms of the bandwidth of consumers of information to be able to digest everything. But there has been a lot of action on the West Bank. There have been missile strikes on the Houthis, and also the Iranian strikes on Israel, causing very limited damage. But we imagine that they will spark a response, and we have the feeling, since maybe the last few weeks or last few months, that every day we are perhaps moving a day closer to disaster. I'm not going to speak too much at length. I will just give the context of this debate, and then I will hand over to our experts. And I feel very honored to be able to be the host of this panel. I don't think that we can understand the 7th of October without, whilst only talking about the confrontation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We cannot imagine really what is going to happen after the 7th of October in the context of this in the terms of a confrontation which is only between Israel and Palestine. And we can't understand what's going on in the Middle East without taking account of their way of seeing the Israel-Palestine issues. And similarly, we can't understand the realignments in the Middle East without thinking about how the 7th of October has completely changed, or not maybe, the geopolitical or geostrategic perceptions and the interests and the strengths and weaknesses of each of the engaging parties. I was talking about it earlier during the lunch break. In terms of these military issues and geostrategic issues, we are caught between the short loop and the depth and the duration. Caught between the bars, the immediacy, and then the depth. I would like to say something a bit personal. I started working on this region only very recently, just a little over a year ago. And after the first 48 hours, I realized that I had been very wrong when I discovered the two main historical references which people get really excited about in Jerusalem: the Bible and the Shoah. Just with that, of course, that justifies that, of course, in order to be able to understand, we need to widen the debate. And therefore, that is why I have before me a panel to allow us to broaden this debate. And I will now hand over first to Céline Touboul, He is co-executive director of the Economic Cooperation Foundation, which is a think tank based in Tel Aviv. Céline spent the week not really knowing whether she was going to be able to come here from Tel Aviv, so we should be very grateful for her being with us and having taken the plane to Paris and left her family behind in terrible circumstances. Céline, if you agree, I would like to have you start the debate on the issue of the inversion of the terror over the last year. On the 7th of October, a year ago, Israel is terrorized. The attack, of course, is horrendous. If you're here, it's because you have the right culture to understand what went on, so I won't expand on that. But since then, Gaza has been razed to the ground. The political leader of the Hamas has been killed in the heart of Tehran. Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, is dead, and with him, a large part of the Hezbollah hierarchy. Lebanon is at war. And the response to Tehran will perhaps take its time, but it will happen. Oh, some technical issues with sounds. Okay, some technical issues there. So my question is, how far will Netanyahu want or be able to go 1 year on? First of all, good afternoon, and I would like to thank the FMES for having invited me here to this event. If I have correctly understood your question, it is, will all this ever end, and what will be the end of the war? I think there are two ways of answering this question. We need to distinguish between the military objectives and the political dimension, which is perhaps even more significant than the military objectives at the stage we're at. One of the main objectives of the war in Gaza, but also in Lebanon, from the point of view of the Israeli government, is to allow a return of the Israeli populations from the north and south of Israel who have been evacuated on the 7th of October and also since the start of the war in Lebanon. When I looked at the figures, we have about 120,000 people who have been displaced, and therefore one of the objectives of this war is to allow them to return and to no longer be subjected to a direct threat, a direct terrorist threat. I think that there is consensus in Israel on this aim. There is not a consensus on many points in Israel, but that one does enjoy a consensus. But to be able to reach this objective, a military operation will not suffice. That's where we enter into the divisions within Israel. So a political strategy is also required in order to be able to maintain the potential tactical gains that the military operation will achieve. The government, and in particular the Prime Minister, has avoided any internal debate on this issue, be it within the army or the Ministry of Defense. There has been no possible debate. There have been works which have been prepared, but the Prime Minister, up until now, has refused to listen to the different scenarios. He is very much under the influence of a fundamentalist minister in his government in terms of his vision of where Israel is going, so a refusal to define political objectives. Now, war is currently allowing the Prime Minister to avoid a commission which would force him to face his responsibilities in the situation which led to the 7th of October. It's his policies with regards to the Palestinians and the Hamas and the choices which he made, and also allows the government, and Abdeslam Motriche in particular, to forward the project of annexation of the West Bank, because the West Bank is something we don't talk about much, but there's a lot going on there on the West Bank, and the government is taking advantage of this war to avoid the fundamental questions of the Israeli-Palestinian relations. Thank you very much, and thank you for this a very succinct answer, because now we will hand over to Pierre Razou, who doesn't really need an introduction, but he is the academic director of the FMES, together with Pascal Hausseur. He is the one who is hosting us today, and Pierre, among many others, is the author of a fundamental paper on the Iran-Iraq war, and so he's very familiar with Iran. And of course, in front of Israel, we have Iran, who's behind the Hamas, behind the Hezbollah, behind the Houthis. Pierre, would you be able, please, to define for us what is a proxy? What is Tehran for all these different groups? Maybe not the same thing for these different groups. It is a being. Is it a tutor? Is it a sponsor? Who is in front of Israel? Thank you, Didier. So what I'd like to say is very much the fruit of my work, my intuition, and my expertise. It is just one thought process among many others. So, of course, you are free to pick and choose within it what you find of interest. So Iran is both a tutor, a master, and a sponsor. But to answer this, we need to come back to what Iran represents today, especially for the proxies. And what emerges from this is that today Iran is in a weakened state. Iran has taken a cold shower. I was part of a conference organized by the FMES in January, and up until then I was saying that clearly Iran was a great beneficiary of what was going on. However, today my understanding is that Iran is one of the actors who's going to end up weakened from what has gone on, unless we have any unexpected U-turns. But for the moment, Iran emerges weakened from this. So initially, with regards to the proxies, Iran had to be involved on the front line, because there came a time when the proxies, if you like, it is the allied militia which have been instrumentalized or manipulated. So the first among them, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Shiite militia in Syria and Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. And I'm not mentioning the Hamas because for me, the Hamas is not a proxy. For me, it is what Lenin would have called the useful fool, i.e. the one whom we use and whom we sacrifice in order to weaken your opponent. So there came a time when these proxies had the desire to become more autonomous, especially the Houthis in Yemen and the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And therefore, there came a time when Iran needed to call on all those, to remind all those who are on the ground who the leader was. And so that's why it reacted directly to Israel. And I won't come back to the events. So for a long time, Iran, so well earlier than the 7th of October last year, Iran was making use of these proxies to weaken Israel on the ground by harassing it. So then we had the war, and the idea here is that the proxies have been considerably weakened. And so today, the armed wing of the Hamas is nearly dead. At least we will need at least a generation for them to be able to recruit in the field and have the emergence of a new generation of fighters. The armed branch of the Hezbollah is strongly demonetized and rendered harmless. And then we have the Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq. But they're also being weakened, and especially in Iraq, they are trying to play the institutional game again. And in Iraq, we see that they are also at once in Syria, they are Bashar al-Assad's insurance policy. And then we have the Houthis. The Houthis in Yemen, if Iran doesn't manage to supply them, then it is similar. After a while, the Houthis will say to the Iranians, well, thank you very much, but I'm going to come back to my own interest. And what is in my interest is to ensure that the northern Yemen should stay within my control and that I should be able to defend my communities. That briefly leads me to talk to you about my point of view with regards to the priorities of Iranian power today, because that also comes into play. The first is, and there also I've reversed the order in the space of a few weeks, is first of all to save face. Since last spring, and especially the Iranian strikes or the Israeli strike, which was retaliatory, the Iranians see and understand that Israel has humiliated by military means the guardians of the revolution, and that is relatively intolerable for the Iranian regime. So the aim is to restore the conventional situation of Iran with regard to Israel. For the United States, no change. For Pakistan, could negotiate that. And with the different bilateral agreements between Iran and other countries, like Azerbaijan, for example, that is still being settled. So today their priority is to avoid finding themselves in a kind of systemic dilemma where today the Iranian regime knows that it is going to have Israeli retaliation. So then the question is, how will they respond? Trying to avoid escalation. I'll come back to that in my last point. The other priority of the regime is the interior domestic front. We can come back to that during the Q&A session, but there is an alliance between the inverted commas reformist president Mahmoud Ashkan and the head of the pragmatic head of the parliament. And between the two of them, they have the absolute majority, and they have understood that if the Iranian regime, i.e. the power, i.e. not the Iranian regime, but the Iranian power, did not answer the population's aspirations, especially in terms of employment, environment, drought, climate change, and economic prosperity, that they we're going to end up in a sticky place. So how can the Iranians get their own back without provoking a major war with Israel and the United States, which leads me to my last point, which is the nuclear element. There are several different understandings of it. There are those who think that Iran has already taken the decision to develop nuclear, and they're just waiting for 2025 to come out of the nuclear proliferation treaty and to go forwards. And others who think that, yes, it is an option, but that the President Pezeshkian already mentioned in New York the nuclear affair, to try to offer New York a kind of big war game on all the issues of that region, and that if the United States don't make the most of this opportunity, that then they will then go into nuclear weaponry earlier than predicted. I would like to thank him for this intervention and for his frankness in explaining how he has changed his opinion several times over the last year. A researcher constantly needs to challenge the relevance of his point of view. Dorothee Schmidt, you work at the IFRI. You are head of the Contemporary Turkey and Middle East program, and you're a specialist in Turkey. And when we prepared for this debate, the idea was to get you to talk about the constraints or the margins of the first circle. And we're going to talk about the Gulf monarchies and Turkey, which talked about the most in the media. What is their position in this crisis? What role are they trying to play? In what situations are they now after a year of conflict? Especially given that, from the point of view of Qatar, especially diplomatic efforts have been made, and there has not been a ceasefire in Gaza. There has not been a release of hostages, and so on. There have been some hostages released in the first week of December, yes. First of all, I would like to thank the FMES to allow us to deepen this dialogue. If you took part in the previous editions, you will realize that the gravity of the discourse is intensifying year on year, and a couple of methodological observations, such as Pierre introduced them, and as you've just repeated them, it is extremely difficult to comment in real time what is going on. For me, there are 2 points. The first is the idea that there is a moral responsibility of the key players in this. And this makes our work a lot more difficult for researchers who are used to trying to imagine that they are isolated and that they are working in inverted commas scientific conditions. But now everything that is said about the current conflict has huge social repercussions, and I think that we are all aware of that, and I think it leads us to find not only our analysis but also our way of talking quite difficult. I don't know if you find this here in the auditorium. I find that the discourse has become a lot more complex. Whilst Pierre was speaking, I felt I had exactly the same things to say. Every 2 days, when I have to talk to financiers of the IFRI, I say, well, I said this in such and such at such and such event, but now I would no longer say that. So we need to be cautious. We also all have biases caused by the way we are constrained in our access to information. We don't have the necessary data to really be able to analyze what is going on. And I'm very struck by what we did in the annual presentation of the IFRI. And there was a presentation on the consequence of the war in Gaza, because it was at that stage still only in Gaza. And as we had very little time, the moderator asked a single question, which was about Israeli political life. And today still we start with Israel, because it is the actor which we feel we have the most transparent vision of. But actually that is not really the case, and we are reduced to conjectures. So I encourage you to try to have the broadest vision possible. And so now I will try to answer the question that you asked me. The Arab Gulf states and Turkey. So, of course, they have two very different positionings with respect to this conflict. Turkey wants to be present and to have a voice and to be present diplomatically, and is waiting for, or is biding its time. And then the Gulf states are embarrassed or in difficulty. You asked a certain number of questions initially, and you said there are 2 actors. There's the Gulf on one side and Turkey on the other. But today, there aren't really 2 sides. Today, we are also more educated than previously to have a more nuanced vision of the different interests of the different protagonists around the Gulf. But I will nevertheless briefly talk to you about my 3 worries, regional worries, which are probably shared by the 3 main protagonists in the Gulf: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. First worry, which is the extension of the failed state in the region. We're going to a failed region around Israel. I don't know if this will bring about security, but there is a Syria where nothing is settled today from a political standpoint. No complete renovation of the territory, occupation of the territory by foreign powers, strong Russian influence. And we've not really talked much about Russia in the preparation of this session, but I think it will come. And today Netanyahu is making threats with regard to Bashar al-Assad, who up until now was the actor who was the implicit ally of Israel when he was restored to power in Syria. So I see this now drifting outside of the region, because if Beirut is bombed without no one reacting, if we are challenging the situation every time Lebanese women raise a little finger, Palestine is not a state. Egypt is extremely worried. We see that Jordan as well is very worried. The whole region is fragile.
So obvious today for the Gulf states, Lebanon isn't a major worry. The Saudis have shown that Hezbollah was an issue for them, that they had no intention to keep on playing the role of automatic financiers for the Lebanese Hezbollah. But if we do have a disaster similar to what is happening in Gaza and in Lebanon, and again, I hear people say, what will be the red line? When should we decide to intervene in Lebanon on the part of the Saudis? So that's the first element, this extension of a sort of a failed region. And I remind you that Iraq isn't a country where governance is particularly efficient either, and where Iran still has important strength. Second element, the economy. Petrol, for the first time since the start of the operation in Lebanon, and for the first time since the question of responses in Iran is being raised, reprisals, the price of petrol has spiked, which means that eventually the Gulf states, the Gulf powers, will be engulfed into this conflict. So right now we have Gulf states that did not want to think about the Palestinian issue. It had been completely brushed away because these states were completely committed to their economic transition, in the idea that we were in a post-fossil fuel economy, so they needed to embark on a transition that was quite difficult since their entire wealth comes from fossil fuel. The fossil fuel market is an essential element to them. And so for Saudis, the priority is to make sure that if Saudis hit Iran, there shouldn't be any impact for the Gulf states. So right now, the diplomatic intervention by the Council is to reassure Iran, to make sure that they're not on the side of the Saudis, which brings me to the Abraham Agreement, which I've been saying for a year. The Abraham Agreements will never be an anti-Iran coalition, but I've heard recently Netanyahu say that these agreements should become that, an anti-Iran coalition. Third topic, when it comes to human governance, again, we have a humanitarian disaster about to happen, not just because of all the civilian deaths, but also because we'll have Syrian refugees that are in Lebanon right now. And again, in Lebanon, people are starting to say we should send the Syrians back. In Turkey, people want to also send Syrians back to Syria. There's about 4 million of them in Turkey, which means that the Turks would need some sort of implicit authorization by the international community, because they'll need to protect these Syrian refugees. So I remind you that Syria is a country where about the 2/3 of the population were displaced or became refugees after the conflict, and a part of that population has settled in Europe. So the question of mass migration isn't a question that is important just for the region, because of course the Gulf states won't be a natural destination for refugees, whether they're Palestinians or Syrians. But now we have that migratory issue is being raised in Europe more and more, and that is an issue that will impact us. I could talk about Turkey again, because it is almost a separate topic. Thank you very much. I almost want to mention also the possibility of having Lebanese refugees coming as well. Yes, indeed. And on top of it, the Palestinian refugees that Egypt is refusing, that Jordan is refusing as well. Again, that is a key element to take into account. I asked a tough question to Dorothée. I gave her 7 minutes. So I'm going to ask another tough question to Laure Fouché. What about the faraway margins? I'm sorry to ask you such a tough question, but Laure Fouché works at FRS. She mostly works on research on the domestic and foreign defense policies of the countries of the Near and Middle East, as well as European policy in the region. Could you tell us a bit more about actors that are external actors, but also very important actors? Maybe we'll have time to talk about China and Russia eventually, but I mostly wanted us to focus on what I consider quite ironic. The US are considered to be the only actor able to weigh on the conflict, and they're not doing it. The Europeans would like to weigh on the conflict, but they're unable to do so. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here in this roundtable. To answer your question, I'll start with an observation, deplorable observation, the lack of power of the international community in its entirety. It is unable to have any influence on the war in Gaza or any influence on preventing the regionalization of the war right now. And additionally, and that is very important because it will have an immediate impact on our strategic interests are in Europe. It has an impact on the erosion of international law, which goes hand in hand with a very worrying normalization of new rules of conflict. So this lack of power of the international community can be explained through local and international dynamics, but also can be explained by the game played by international actors, including, firstly, the United States. So, of course, we have to ask ourselves that question. What is the will, what is the capacity, the ability of the White House of the United States to influence the wars at play right now? And to answer that question with prudence, of course, I think we have to take a step back and remind what the priorities are in the American policy in the region since at least the era of Obama. And these are, first of all, reducing the military footprint in the region. Secondly, refusing to become encroached in crises, refusing to weigh in on conflict resolution. It's more about containment of crises than resolution of crises. And these priorities have manifested themselves by a will of giving the means to the regional actors to be in charge of their own security by boosting their military capabilities and by favoring the creation of regional coalitions. And that is the basis for the Abraham agreements. And we can see now today that that strategy, considering what's taking place today, that strategy was based on a fallacy, which was that The crises in the Middle East, as Dorothée reminded us, are numerous, are all connected. So it was based on the fallacy that we could treat crises in an isolated way in the Middle East. It was also based on a will to escape militarily without any political vision behind it. And we can see it unfolding in Gaza. The American policy in Gaza was based on two things. First of all, the small bargain and the grand bargain. And in the grand bargain, again, we're basing it on the Abraham agreements. We're trying to convince the Israeli government to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, hoping that this will mean eventually that there will be a recognition of a Palestinian state. Of course, that failed. In spite of the diplomatic activism by the United States, because the US aren't absent diplomatically, they're actually very present, very active, but it has failed. They encountered many obstacles, and I think that is due mainly to the intransigence by the Israeli government, firstly by the Israeli prime minister. So that wall that the US have faced has not meant that the Biden administration they've actually decided not to use some of the levers they had. We've seen that the Biden administration has been very prudent in using these levers, and many thought the US were the only actor that was able to weigh in on this conflict. I think that little by little, the United States ended up in a position that was less and less comfortable because they were increasingly isolated in their support to Israel. And in parallel to that, they were unable to impose red lines or even to take control over the escalation taking place. Which leads me to talk about Lebanon and the American policy in Lebanon. Until the end of August, at least so far as I know, there was a very clear veto imposed by Washington, D.C. regarding a military offensive in southern Lebanon. The fact that the US couldn't weigh in on Gaza meant that the US has invested a lot in Lebanon instead. But again, that policy has failed as well. And I would explain it by two main factors. Firstly, by failing to impose a ceasefire in Gaza in a certain way, the US had already lost control over the evolution of the situation and left the door open to an offensive in Lebanon. The second factor, I think, give me 1 second, I just lost track of what I wanted to say. Yes, I wanted to talk about the American policy has evolved at the end of August, beginning of September, especially after the tactical gains by Israel in Lebanon. It does seem like in a part of the Biden administration there was optimism when it came to what Israel could accomplish militarily. Very quickly, maybe we could establish a tie with the upcoming American elections and the importance of this issue in the election results. Doesn't this situation weigh in or influence Biden's comments, Kamala Harris's comments, Trump's comments? Of course, Kamala Harris is in a very uncomfortable position because of the divisions within the Democratic Party. This is an issue that has a huge influence on their campaign. I am not going to read a crystal ball and try and tell you how the victory of this person or that person is going to influence the American policy in the region, because first of all, we have no idea of what the next American president will inherit in terms of situation. The situation is evolving really fast, as we've said, but also because the American candidates might have a policy line, a policy that we can understand, but we have no idea the way they will implement it depending on the situation. So these policies are also riddled with uncertainties. Thank you. You've mentioned the necessary humility and prudence, and this is something that journalists know very well. I usually say that a good report by a journalist is valid for about 24 hours, and then it can be used to wrap potato peels. All five of us, a month ago, we had defined a series of questions, and then a few days ago, we asked ourselves, what should we do? Should we just start from scratch or keep these topics on the table? So we've decided to now broach similar topics to the ones raised a month ago. Céline, I wanted to ask you this question, and I'm asking you this question, because the question has been asked for about a year, and I haven't heard anyone answer that question. So if you can do it, kudos to you. The October 7th disaster and everything that unfolded after that. Ironically, isn't it the biggest chance we have to solve the conflict? Maybe based on this ideal, this utopia that once you've hit rock bottom, you have to find a way to get back up to the surface. So does this apply in this situation? Is it a likely scenario? And if it is, what are the interests, the strategic interests for everyone that could lead to a possible solution? And I'm talking about strategic interests, and I'm not talking about human grandeur and great values such as that of Kamel Daoud. We've seen on social media for about a year, Laurence Bénard, who's a great specialist of hatred online, she calls it hemiplegic empathy, that is the inability of one side to see the suffering of the other side. The Palestinians do not understand the hell that was October 7th, and the Israelis refuse to see the horrors of Gaza. So I'm talking only about strategic interests. What strategic interests could lead to a potential solution? First of all, to come back to this idea, can we emerge from the crisis that broke out on October 7th with a potential solution? Well, for the moment, it seems to be very far from the reality we are in, but it depends whom you ask. From a Palestinian viewpoint, but also from the viewpoint of the Arabic states that are involved, it is true for two main reasons. First of all, because the control over Gaza by Hamas and the division of the West Bank and of the Gaza Strip remains, still is a massive obstacle in the two-state solution. Today, the Hamas has been weakened. It still maintains a certain type of control over Gaza, specifically over its social and religious networks, through its social and religious networks, but also because throughout Israel it is trying to have a Palestinian alternative emerge. But the Hamas government in Gaza doesn't function anymore. That reality might leave the door open to a return of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. Second reason, all the Arabic states that had said they were willing to participate in the reconstruction of Gaza, that had even said they were willing to send troops over to participate in a stabilization effort, they actually present the same conditions as the Palestinian Authority. They're willing to commit to participate in the reconstruction of Gaza as long as it doesn't make them complicit of the occupation, of the Israeli occupation, and they will not participate in a post-war effort if that effort doesn't allow everyone to come back to scratch and move forward towards a resolution of the conflict. So as long as Israel doesn't change its policies in the West Bank in order to allow for credible progress, and the word credible is often used as well by the American administration in that context, then they won't want to participate. This is an unwavering condition for them to be involved, and it is essential as well to have a legitimate Palestinian solution in Gaza. The question of the political governance, as you said, is crucial when we try and think of what could help make the region more stable and make the relations between Israelis and Palestinians more stable. It is that. From an Israeli viewpoint, it is out of the question right now to cooperate with this approach. The current Israeli government coalition is determined to have the Palestinian national project fail, and it sees the Palestinian Authority as almost a greater threat than Hamas, because for it, it is kind of the embryo of a state. And up until now, the Israeli government has refused to answer this essential question, which is, if it is neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority controlling Gaza, who will control it? Unfortunately, the tragic alternative, which is tragic both for Israelis and Palestinians, the tragic alternative that Netanyahu and his government have been considering for the last few weeks, is the imposition of an Israeli military government over Gaza, some kind of pilot model that might be extended after that to other areas outside of the Gaza Strip. The Israeli Ministry for Defense and the Israeli army are absolutely against that idea, because that regime would then become the main military and security effort, and it would diminish the capacity of the Israeli army to be committed on other fronts. This is a question that profoundly divides the government at the moment, is a source of tension between the Prime Minister and the Minister for Defense, as well as the military apparatus. Netanyahu is considering this option at the moment without asking anyone's opinion. And we've seen that he has, in a surreal way, invited the Minister for War without inviting the Minister for Defense and the military officers to debate this question, which led yesterday the Prime Minister to torpedo the visit of the Minister for Defense in DC that had been planned in order to discuss the Israelis' response to Iran and to discuss Israel's plans in Gaza and Lebanon. So, emerging from the crisis after the war, finding a solution that would be supported by Israel and the Arabic states. In order to find that, we have to treat the entire Palestine-Israel issue in its entirety and not just think of what needs to be put in place in Gaza. If we want the situation to be different, if we want to find an alternative to Hamas in power in Gaza. What is very important, I think, and Laure, you mentioned it, is that there's a parallel to be drawn between the conditions for engagement of states in Gaza and the normalization of relations and the integration effort, because both are tied to the same conditions. The link between the two, I think, is also the key we have to use to get out of this dead end. And I think that was the starting point as well for the Americans, which is why they've decided to focus their diplomatic effort on these two tracks in parallel. One that could potentially be used to progress on the other track and could be used to convince Israel to change its policy when it comes to Palestine. Please be brief. I have to give the mic to your colleague after that. There's one thing. You mentioned strategic interests. We often talk about what Israel does not want, of their rejection of the Palestinian state project. It's important to realize there are three strategic interests that foster consensus in Israel right now. First of all, regional integration. Secondly, the necessity to reinforce their alliance with the US. And thirdly, their will to end the war through avoiding having Hamas coming back to power. So if we try and push Israel in another direction, we have to use these 3 points of consensus with which a big part of the Israeli population and the Israeli apparatus agree. Thank you very much. Of course, Pierre, no peace is possible without Iran accepting it. So without terms that are favorable to Iran as well. I'd like to come back to what happened back in July. The Hamas leader is in his villa in a rich neighborhood in Tehran. And even if Mossad hasn't owned up to it officially, because they will never do that, no one dared pretend it could be anyone else. So the Israelis went and killed a figure, a hugely important figure in the heart of Tehran. This is a huge humiliation. And then we have the Beeper operation against the Hezbollah. As we all know, the Hezbollah is the insurance that protects the Iranian regime. You've mentioned this before, but how can Iran gain power again, can gain deterrence again, not nuclear deterrence for the moment, and find its regional position in a Middle East that would be stable or stabilized? And of course, we don't know if that will be the case. As I was saying, what Iran needs is to restore conventional deterrence vis-à-vis the Gulf states. We've talked about it earlier. Dorothée did as well. What we have to keep in mind is that the Iranian regime is truly terrified, and that is quite a new thing. The direct physical elimination of leaders, not of Hamas, because when it comes to Hamas, Israel lacks information clearly and had given up on collecting intelligence, but had a lot of information on Hezbollah and Iran. So Iran now thinks this could happen to us as well. So there's a true fear within Iran. They are worried that they might become a target. When you are scared, you try to scare other people. This morning, Iran, through their government speaker, said very clearly to the Gulf states, they said, if the Gulf states let Israeli planes, aircrafts go over their skies, either publicly or by pretending they're not there, Iran will directly target key installations of the Gulf states in question, which is a way to indirectly recognize their weakness militarily in face of Israel, and also to say we cannot hit directly Israel as long as Israel has enough interceptors to intercept Iranian ballistic missiles. So we will hit where it hurts the most, which is in the underbelly, in a way, the Gulf states. And no specific goals need to be set because every one of these countries is very vulnerable. It's enough to just destroy 5 or 6 targets, maybe just 1 or 2 for Qatar, and that's enough. So when it comes to the usual neighbors, I would say that deterrence works. When it comes to Israel and the US, it's a bit different. In the US, during electoral times, it's quite easy. We can see easily how the US will struggle to tell their population just 2 weeks before the presidential election that a few big military bases in the region have been hit by short distance missiles. So the issue that remains is that of Israel now. And when it comes to Israel, for Iran, it's kind of a poker game. The question that Iranian leaders probably ask themselves is how many ballistic missiles can we produce every month, and how many interceptors, so Arrow 2, Arrow 3 type missiles. How many of these can Israel receive from the US every month? So this is just pure math. So we can tell this is just about numbers, and all the actors are thinking of these numbers, and this is basic math. Dorothée, could we talk briefly about Turkey? Their positioning is sometimes difficult to understand. Erdogan has screamed when Anier was killed. He called him his brother, but then he also doesn't want the destruction of Israel. He seems to be positioning himself on both sides, just like he does usually in his foreign policy when it comes to NATO, when it comes to Russia. What maneuvers could Turkey have? What margins for error does Turkey have? And what are the goals of Turkey in this whole situation? I'll start with Turkey, and then I'll also take a step back and try to widen the debate as well, to come back to what my colleagues were saying. Turkey has a history, first of all, with Israel that is quite a strong history, because it is the first Muslim country having recognized the State of Israel. It is a country that has had a military alliance with Israel back in the 90s, and it is a country that detached itself from Israel very slowly after the party that said itself democratic and Islamist of Erdogan came into power in 2002.
And at the start, I remember that there was a period of transition which lasted 2 or 3 years in terms of the perception of the regime. Europeans debated a lot about the compatibility between Islam and democracy, and then very quickly the regime gave pro-European signals, and at the time they were ready to give the benefit of doubt to this political party and to say that we want Turkey to be our ally because Turkey is part of the actors in the Middle East which are not Arab. And so it's always this kind of tension. And then we had a strong deterioration of the relationship with Israel in 2007, 2008, until 2010, a complete break in relations, a military incident at the origin of this, because it's still possible that today, Erdogan says, from time to time, beware, if the Israelis go too far, we could become militarily engaged, and Israel then retaliated, saying one day we could threaten Turkey. So there is this idea that Turkey, as a military power, would position itself in this rapid deterioration of asymmetrical warfare as a power which could one day engage itself in conventional conflict. And of course, that is extremely worrying possibility. I don't think it is really the way in which Erdogan is strategically projecting himself, but I think he has a capacity for as a deterrent, because it is a strong military power in the region. And from an electoral point of view, Erdogan today is partly elected by the Turkish nationalists, and the issue is how these Turkish nationalists perceive the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some of them see themselves as closer to Israel than to the Arab countries. That is important to note. This nationalist current isn't necessarily very pro-Palestinian and pro-Islam. And so there is not an extreme resonance of this call from the Israelis, and especially there is no real appetite for war in Turkey. And there we've got to see how Turkey has positioned itself faced to the Ukraine-Russia war. Turkey's nature is to remain relatively neutral, or at least in an politically engaged neutrality, but not in military terms, in terms of the conflicts which are happening in its neighborhood. And do you think Ukraine could be a possible mediator in the situation, but also the Russias? So the balance is very unusual. And I remember that the beginning of the Ukraine war, the Turkish were taking, as a point of comparison, the Second World War, where they avoided taking position until they really understood that the Germans had lost the war, and then they declared war on Germany right at the end of 1945. So there is no appetite for war in Turkey. It is fairly obvious today. And that's why I think that this pro-Palestinian mobilization is also a rhetorical aspect for Erdogan, but has no real link with the way that he perceives Turkish diplomacy. Nevertheless, it is very interesting, and that's really what I wanted to broaden the debate to see in which multilateral circles Turkey is making itself heard. So then we have the Gulf states, the Arab League. The Turkish Minister for Foreign Affairs was invited by the Arab League, where he wanted to be presented, and he presented the idea of a Muslim coalition which would oppose Israel and stop it from going too far in its war with its neighbours, and it joins the Saudi preoccupation because during the last UN General Assembly, the Israelis presented the idea of a coalition of protection of the Palestinians, and the Saudis rather said that we should have a protection lead for the Palestinians. Mind you that in the past, when Donald Trump announced the transfer of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the Iranians were the first to complain, and they asked for a special meeting of the OCI, which is normally led by the Saudis, to protest against what they consider as a kind of symbolic assault on Jerusalem. And the third arena, which is of interest, it's the BRICS countries. Why? Well, because last year we had the integration into this organization, which is meant to be an economic organization of big emerging economies, which is becoming more and more political, and which is kind of acting as a kind of a platform of the global south, of which we're not sure whether it really exists or not. The BRICS have taken in Iran, the Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, somewhat hesitantly, and during the next session, which will take place in Russia, the Israelis have officially asked to join the BRICS. They've been talking about it for a number of years, but they have officially asked to be candidates. For the moment, it has been turned down. But last summer, the Palestinian authorities also asked to join the BRICS, which is quite extraordinary. So that shows that it's a very symbolic place of political action. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to move on to law, because we're talking about multilateralism, and in a certain way we can consider that the European Union is already a form of multilateralism. And so perhaps you could explain to us why it is so demonetized. Then we also need to mention the United Nations, who don't manage to do anything, and the most bizarre symbol is what happens at the border. So the UN forces at the border, and who, as soon as it becomes a bit dangerous, retreat to their barracks. And so the UN Security Council is such that there is no decisive resolution. So can the United Nations still do something, and can the EU wake up and maybe weigh in one way or another? And then we will try to go on to the questions from the audience. With regards to the EU, I will answer very briefly and with reluctance. And it is that already in the perception of the local actors, the European Union, beyond its financing and aid capabilities, the EU is an unidentified object. The EU hasn't managed to get rid of its reputation in the region, which is to be a payer and not a player. And it is even more obvious in the wars in Lebanon and in Gaza. The EU has always been extremely divided on the Israeli-Palestinian question. These divisions have increased, and therefore I think that we need to wait until March in order to have a declaration which will, if I remember correctly, call on a humanitarian ceasefire or truce. And here we're not talking, we're just talking politics, just talking of a declaration. And so, of course, to imagine that the EU could be tempted to look at what the possible enablers she might have in order to influence the outcome of war is something that we're still very far from. And some countries have attempted to do this, but the divisions are such that the EU isn't able to weigh in on the conflict. And I also think that that is the case in Lebanon, where, if nothing has changed, Joseph Borrell has had to make a declaration in his own name, given that there has been no agreement amongst the 27 on a ceasefire. So within this context about the EU, there are also the UN agencies which are targeted by Israel's accusations for having maybe organized for some of its members the 7th of October, and which has been under Israeli fire. And so this is a terrible defeat of or failure of the United Nations. What do you have to say about this? It depends what you're talking about when you talk about the United Nations. The United Nations Refugee Agency has been strongly criticized, but this agency is the only structure to this date able to do anything in Gaza. So if we're talking about this kind of structure, I don't think we can reduce the United Nations to such an impotence or or as useless player. If we're talking about this United Nations Security Council, it is only the sum of its members. And I would say that we had a stalemate, and it's very interesting to see what the French have tried to do. France has been very active within the United Nations Security Council in cooperation with the group of 5 Arab countries in order to try to bring about several resolutions, but faced with the current composition of the Security Council, France does not really have enough weight, and I think that the regional actors are quite aware of this. And I think this is perhaps the last point about current European policy. I think that the Europeans have lost interest since many years, and it has really deepened with the war in Gaza, perhaps even more with the war in Lebanon. And for the actors of the region, the Europeans are neither military nor diplomatic force, and that in terms of the public opinions in the region, being able to weigh in is often equivalent to being complicit, and therefore the future European capacity to play a role must also be seen through this lens. And this also calls into question our future ability to play a role. Now I'll move on to questions. It seems to me there's a certain number which we have already answered If I may, I'm going to try to avoid the issue of knowing, are we necessarily going towards the worst, be it nuclear or not, because I think the worst is never something written in stone, and we find it hard enough to understand the present and the past. So if we start looking at the future, we are certain to get it wrong. There's a question I find interesting about the efficiency of the Mossad among the proxies. Making a comparison with the 7th of October, I will answer just the first part because I put this question to a certain number of people, and indeed the beeper, the pagers explosions, of course, is part of a wider moral question. The fact that there are civilian deaths. These are quite exceptional operations. Why is Israel the only nation able to do this? And Israeli answered, because we are the only ones to have a need for this, because we have implemented intelligence services for 70 years with the capacity for action, and therefore we could also legitimately ask, why did they not foresee what happened on the 7th of October? Perhaps there's an issue of cognitive bias, because they really did not believe that the Hamas would be capable of that. How do you see things? I'm no expert, unlike Pierre. But the Israeli intelligence services, their work is also based on certain assumptions, working assumptions. And there's some kind of arrogance with regards to the Hamas, which does not exist with regards to the Hezbollah. And this arrogance was such that the Hamas could be bought. You could manage this relationship with them by allowing a certain opening of the border with Gaza, certain economic measures allowing the entry of workers, all sorts of tactical measures which, in the end, in the eyes of Israel on this, with regard to the 7th of October, would allow them to think that the Hamas would have too much to lose by going to war. But finally, by completely ignoring the facts that the aim of the Hamas as a Palestinian movement is to rise to the leadership of the OLP, and motivated by an ideological objective, which is its DNA, which is the achievement of a national Palestinian project, which, if it gives up on it, it loses its raison d'être. And I think that there also is something that's important which took place in the confrontations in May 2021, where the Hamas also changed its tactics by linking any confrontation with Israel to developments in Jerusalem. And as a reminder, in May 2021, a war in Gaza was not just a war in Gaza. It would lead to a confrontation with the West Bank and the Arab-Israeli population, with Lebanon. And it's taken proportions that go well beyond a Gaza-Israel confrontation. And yet the Hamas was a huge strategic victory because it managed to position itself as an actor which is not just there to preserve the very limited territorial interests of Gaza and its population there, but the Palestinian cause as a whole. And it's managed to do it only because of its commitment to action with Israel was triggered by provocations in Jerusalem. And since May 2021, the Hamas was determined to not abandon or lose this strategic win. And therefore, I think it was clear, or at least you tried to warn several times over that this was the case, that certain actions to improve the life of the population in Gaza and to allow the Hamas to consolidate its power in Gaza could not in themselves contain the ideological and national aims of the movement. Pierre? No, nothing to add? However, there is another question, which is perhaps for you, which is of interest, and which I think we have mentioned this morning during the roundtable on the future challenges of the army. If Iran continues its attacks and that Israel runs out of ballistic missiles, does it have any other options other than nuclear escalation? What will happen? Do you think that potentially Israel might at some stage find itself faced with a capacity issue across its whole arsenal of air defense? As I was saying earlier, we are in a war of attrition. If I put myself in the shoes of either the commander of the revolution or on the Israeli side, all my conventional means have been used up. However, we have ballistic missiles, so it is a war of attrition. So I know well that when Israel is helped by the United States, especially with the connections with NORAD and the anti-missile and air defense systems that the Israeli have, Israel is able to intercept between 90 and 97% of missiles. So the Iranian pragmatism is to say, okay, let's mutually wear each other out. And when we know that the Israelis have no more means of interception, we will have achieved the threshold of interception, like we can have in a naval war, and things will change. And I also know that the Israelis don't have any means to, or enough means to intercept air raids. So, which is the most resilient population, which is able to support the most? And that is without even talking about nuclear, that is within a conventional scenario. The second part of the answer is that because the Israelis have other ways of applying pressure without necessarily using Iran, it can be to create chaos in Syria. And Dorothée was mentioning this earlier, Céline as well. The Israeli logic can be, I will not hit the brain, so I will hit the arms. So that is Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. And on the other side, the Iranians are probably saying, well, whoever wins the American elections, so now I'm encroaching a little bit on Law's territory, because be it Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, both want to withdraw American troops, both from America and Syria. And if Tehran sees this, they will be very happy. So the timing is perfect. I will now ask you a question as a conclusion for each of you. Dorothée, you wanted to add something. Yes, I had a question to put to Céline, and which comes down to one of the questions which was put to Pierre. When Céline says that one of Israel's objectives is its integration in the region, I wonder what that means today. And when we talked about the regional integration of Iran, I think Iran is not just looking towards the Middle East, and that's why I'm also emphasizing all the multilateral institutions. For example, Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization a couple of years ago. It has closed its ties with Russia since the Ukraine war. It perceives its regional integration and its economic success coming from the East and also clearly from Asia. And so it seems to me quite important to understand that we cannot limit our view of Iran as being tragic face-to-face, and that maybe the United States will preserve it from a form of destruction, which is rather what we're talking about. We're talking about a very strong weakening. And so I think it is important to remember, when I was mentioning BRICS earlier, that when in November 2023 we had a video conference among the BRICS at the request of Russia to discuss Gaza, and the conclusion was not a condemnation of Israel's actions, but rather a call for restraint from all the actors. But it demonstrates that they have other means with other political coalitions, and that they have something to say at different moments of this conflict. Initially, there was a question. So, Céline. So, if I can ask you to be brief, please. What is meant by regional integration? Israel and the Israeli audience, something which they hold close and dear to their heart, is the wanting to be accepted within the region. A territorial linkage, to not be an island. They have a feeling of being an island in Israel. A very strong feeling, insular feeling. And it is a need not only for the population to feel that they are legitimate and accepted, but also something which is important for the legitimacy of any political act in Israel to be accepted in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi, just like in Washington. It's also that which creates a leader in Israel. So those are the two reasons why it's important. And I would just like to ask another question, which I think we haven't tried to answer, but I think a fundamental question when we look at the war in Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is to realize that Hamas is not going to disappear, even if it is militarily weakened, but as a movement, it is not going to suddenly evaporate, and it is a permanent source of angst for the Israelis and also for the Palestinian authorities, who will not be able to implement their national project or give birth to their national project without settling this question. I am very much in agreement, and I think I will perhaps please the military staff in this room. There is no successful military operation if there is not a tangible political ambition behind it. And so when Netanyahu wanted to eradicate the Hamas, fundamentally he had brought together everything that was necessary for a failure. So you have 1 minute each, and 1 minute each on a very straightforward question. It's my journalistic side emerging. Have we asked the right questions? So in other words, over the last year, we have seen a lot of strategic realignments, or are the fault lines, or have the fault lines simply deepened? In any case, of course, we can always be wrong. Pierre, very briefly. Yes, we are seeing political realignments or geopolitical realignments. Thank you for having asked this question, because it means I will be able to promote our strategic atlas of the Mediterranean and Middle East, where you have the map which was displayed earlier. We have our map specialist here, who I'd like to thank on behalf of the FMES for his talent. And so all those who are interested in this, and it gives a part of the answer to Didier, you will find this on sale on the first floor. Now I will talk with my historian hat on. And from an optimistic point of view, as a historian, it is the first time that in a Middle Eastern conflict implicating Israel, None of the non-warring factions, except Iran, therefore, by ricochet Israel, none of them have any interest in fanning the flames of the fire. None, not the concerned powers or the regional powers. And I think that is very significant. Now I'd like to hand over to Laure, because Pierre, you say that no one has an interest in fanning the flames, and yet everyone is doing it. And I'm not being provocative, because I want to hand over to Laure afterward, because they will talk from the point of view of the outside actors. For the last 3 months, everyone in France is saying, but Putin has no interest in going into Ukraine, and he did it. So the question is, what is the rationality of how rational is the other? So, Laure, are we seeing political realignments or deepening of fault lines? So I think there are several elements. I think there are tendencies which have guided the actions of these states, like, for example, the Gulf states wanting to maintain a good channel of communication with Iran. The normalization agreements have not been challenged, so there are nevertheless trends which are there. That said, in my opinion, I think we are faced with a strategic rupture starting on the 7th of October, which is in the calculations made by the different actors. First and foremost, Israel, i.e. a zero tolerance towards Iranian proxies. And we see today that this, as Pierre was mentioning, this changes the balance of power in the region today. So it depends what your point of view is, and that's it. Dorothée?
Excusez-moi si je pianote.
I'm sorry if I'm typing on my phone, it's because I'm taking notes, because I find it necessitates a lot of spontaneous reactions. First of all, on what Pierre was saying, in principle, no one has an interest to exacerbate the situation. But at least in Israel and Iran, we have two actors that are in a survival mode, with Hezbollah as well. So we won't go to any extreme, because no one wants to risk their life, because we are fragile. However, these two actors are going so far with no idea of what the opponent is able to do in order to restore some kind of stability, that it's actually difficult to think that we'll never reach the worst case scenario. I find it hard to say that today. Now, a little joke about the idea of Israel finding its regional place. Well, I find that Israel became a Middle East actor in terms of now it thinks that it needs to eradicate its enemies. So it's almost like a regional tradition. You have to get rid of the one who doesn't agree with you. And historically, it's never worked out. It's never been the right solution, of course. But when we talk about the regional positioning of Israel, the Gulf isn't Israel's region. The question is now why Egypt is seeing itself as being weakened by the situation, the king in Jordan as well, and you cannot make peace with people that you weren't at war with. So yes, the Gulf states didn't always recognize Israel, but they also weren't at war with Israel. Third thing, and that's why I insist so much upon the question of, I think Isabelle was saying, the Russians call it the global majority, what we call the global south. I think on the diplomatic stage, there's an isolation of Israel, and that is quite worrying. I think we need to help Israelis to realize that. They have to understand that if their first allies are going to be the Gulf states, again, we've said it, it is a diplomatic dead end for the Gulf states. They will not defend Israel against Iran. So I now have the heavy task, I'm now giving you the heavy task of concluding in 1 minute, please. I'm going to pick up on the word rationality that you've used earlier, and also pick up on what you've said regarding the goal of eradicating our enemies, which completely lacks rationality. I think we can all agree on that. think we have to distinguish here between two important actors in Israel: the Prime Minister, who is an irrational political actor, who only works towards his own political survival and is faced with an army and Israeli military leaders and an Israeli Minister for Defense, that is also a political actor, who are completely aware that the goals that have been set are completely irrational and that the eradication of the enemy isn't possible. Maybe during the first 6 months of the war, they were silent. They didn't mention how impossible it was to achieve these goals. But now they're not silent anymore. They're not keeping silent anymore because I think they've realized that Israel was headed towards a disaster. And these goals that it set for itself will be an existential threat for Israel, not just on the political front, but also economically. A week ago, Israel was deranked by the Moody's agency, and that's something that resonates in Israel. And it's also due to the fact that these goals that it has set for itself are not realistic, and everyone knows it. I think even the Prime Minister knows it. But he does not want to end this war for the reasons I gave earlier. Great. Thank you very much. It is now time to wrap up. Of course, it's been said many times, maybe in 6 months, in a year from now, everything that we've said today will turn out to be completely wrong. In which case, I suggest we all deny that we've ever said these things.